Welcome to episode number 12 of the OBRY Hours. I am your host, John MacTimas, and today I am going to be presenting to you a lot of information and evidence on a topic that is very big. It's very large in its implication and in its scope, biblically and non-biblically. This is a topic that it is so big and it's so far-reaching that I've tried, before I even made this podcast, if it's a podcast, I tried a number of methods to perhaps reduce the amount of material to make it, more palatable or easier to digest, maybe to even make it simpler. But at this point in time, I don't know how much I can simplify it. And the hour is late. The hour is quite late. And these are things that we need to know and understand. Why is it important? It is important because, for instance, the whole reason why the idea of Zionism and the support of the Jews taking over the state of Palestine, the area of Palestine, it's all based on biblical information. There is an overwhelming amount of passages, just raw biblical material concerning the people of Israel being returned to their own land. In the latter times, they would be dispersed from their land for quite a long time. Their cities would lie in ruins and waste. And then when they were returned, they would not be returned because they had fully repented. But when they were returned, that would be the last stages of perfecting them. They would be remarkably changed in their captivity. And they would spend a great many years in their captivity in foreign lands. And in those lands, they would be changed. They would be dramatically changed as people. Their natures, in fact, would be fundamentally altered. Then they would be brought back to the land promised to their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the very same land, not a new land, the very same land. And I'll show you this. These passages are, of course, included in some upcoming works I have scheduled as well, but they're really important because you need to know the immense weight that there is to this topic and why it is so very important. This is, again, why there is so much support to Zionism. Of course, anyone who chooses to look can see that the Jews have never been fundamentally changed. They are not a blessing on anyone. They are, in fact, quite a curse to any people who are trusting enough or ignorant enough to allow them to come amongst their societies and ravage them and exploit them. But there is another people that exists in this world that are so unique, even from the others of their own kind and race. They've actually become known. There is a synonym for the Western European. That synonym stood for a long time before it was eradicated from our literature and our mind. The synonym for the Western European man was Christian. It was literally synonymous with the Western European man. So, let me give you a couple of passages. As I said, there's no easy and fast, simple way to present this. But before I tell you exactly what it is, and you might get it from the title, before I tell you exactly what this is and what this is all about, we go into all of the material that's going to be involved with this. I'm going to just solidify it quickly by giving you just a couple of these passages so you understand that this is the reason. Zionism is not based on things that are made up. It's based on an overwhelming amount of biblical material. The problem is, it is misappropriated. It is applied to the wrong people. It is applied to the wrong land. And what I'm going to be going over in here has so much to do with identifying the right land and being able to identify that the land that they claim is the land of Canaan, the land promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is a fraud. It's false. It's phony. It could never work as the Canaan of the Bible. These things are massively, massively important. So just a quick couple of passages on this. The first passage is found in Ezekiel 36. Now we could start in verse 16, but I won't. I'm going to start a bit after that. In verse 24, "For I will take you from among the heathen, and gather you out of all countries, and will bring you into your own land. Then will I sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean. From all your filthiness and from your idols will I cleanse you. A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you shall keep my judgments and do them. And you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers. And you shall be my people, and I will be your God. I will also save you from all your uncleanness, and I will call for the corn, and I will increase it, and lay no famine upon you. And I will multiply the fruit of the tree and the increase of the field, that ye shall receive no more reproach of famine among the heathen. Then shall you remember your own evil ways and your doings that were not good, and shall loathe yourselves in your own sight for your iniquities and your abominations. And not for your sakes do I do this, says Adonai Yahweh. Be it known unto you, be ashamed and confounded for your own ways, O house of Israel. Thus saith Adonai Yahweh, in the day that I shall have cleansed you from all of your iniquities, I will also cause you to dwell in the cities, and the wastes shall be builded, and the desolate land shall be tilled, whereas it lay desolate in the sight of all that had passed by. And they shall say, this land was desolate, is become like the Garden of Eden, and the waste and desolate and ruined cities are become fenced and inhabited. Then the heathen that are all left round about you shall know that I, Yahweh, built the ruined places. Plant that was desolate. I, Yahweh, have spoken it, and I will do it. Thus saith Adonai Yahweh, I will yet for this be inquired by the house of Israel, and to do it for them I will increase them with men like a flock, as the holy flock, as the flock of Jerusalem in her solemn feasts. So shall the waste cities be filled with flocks of men, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. Now there's one more, and this one will be briefer, but it is the next chapter, and it relates directly to what we just heard. So starting in Ezekiel 37:21, and I'm sorry for some of the choppiness in the reading, but a lot of the passages that have those little grayed italics words trip me up because I don't like them. Those are inserted words. So I actually try to read without those words whenever I can, and it does trip me up sometimes. But starting in Ezekiel 37:21, and say unto them, Thus saith Adonai Yahweh, Behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen where they be gone, and I will gather them on every side, and bring them into their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land upon the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king to them all, and they shall be no more two nations. neither shall they be divided into 2 kingdoms any more at all. Neither shall they defile themselves any more with their idols, nor with their detestable things, nor with any of their transgressions, but I will save them out of all of their dwelling places wherein they have sinned, and I will cleanse them. So shall they be my people, and I will be their God. And David my servant will be king over them, and they all shall have one shepherd. They shall also walk in my judgments, and observe my statutes, and do them. And they shall dwell in the land that I have given unto Jacob my servant, wherein your fathers have dwelt. And they shall dwell therein, even they and their children and their children's children forever. And my servant David shall be their prince forever. Moreover, I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will place them and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in the midst of them forevermore. Now, a couple of things that you have to keep in mind. One is that this prophecy has never come to pass. And this is all entirely part of a prophecy at the end of Ezekiel concerning Israel in the latter times. Israel and Judah have never historically come together as one nation of people. Remember, Judah is made of a few tribes, Israel is made of a number of tribes. They have never historically come together as one people. And he says he will bring them to the land and he will make them pure. It didn't say he would make them pure altogether before he brought them back to the land. And now this is not a land like some would have you think, because they're stuck on Palestine. They would have you think that there was a promise of a different land in the future, and they take it from an obscure passage in, I believe it's 1 Samuel. Very obscure passage, very hard to prove, when these passages are crystal clear, black and white. This is why it's been so easy to get an overwhelming amount of support for Zionism. But again, we have the wrong people and we have the wrong land. Now, a lot of people are waking up to the fact that they are the wrong people and we are getting the right people correct. Finally, those common people of the land called Western Europeans, because that was one of the lands of our captivities besides Upper Asia and Eastern Asia, where a lot of our migrations came from. And there's a reason why it came from the upper north like that in the regions of Asia. And other migrations would appear to have happened from starting in the regions of, say, Upper Scandinavia and the UK and the islands north of the UK and Iceland, down into mainland Europe, and then out and eastward and southward from there. There's a reason why we can see all of these migrations oftentimes coming from the extreme north of Asia and Europe and migrating downward and westward. It's because, well, it has a lot to do with the way that the north used to be in warmer days. And we know that the north has gotten cooler little by little over many, many, many years, over ages. So this is the exact same land we're talking about that was given to our father Jacob. The same land. We have to come back to the same land. It has to be the right land. It has to be the right people. Now, the reason that this is so important in this late hour is because of the next couple of chapters. After this, we see Ezekiel 38 and 39, where Gog of the land of Magog, as well as a number of the tribes and peoples who were once tribes and peoples who were near us, or we had dealings with in the ancient times, and these are not Arabs. These are people, many of them just as white as you or I, because back then, these kingdoms and many of the peoples that lived bordered on one another and fought wars with one another, we were all tribes descended from common ancestors, so we were all of the same race. This is why so many people have trouble putting everything together. They don't understand that Europe was the land of our captivity, It was not our people that reigned over these lands as kings and lords and royalty and so on. We were the common people. We were in captivity, being lorded over by other people that were not Israelites. This is why it bothers me so much to hear so many people using these arguments as though whites were somehow monolithic, when nothing historically could be further from the truth. Not even within the last 100 years, if you look at the two world wars of the early 20th century and what white people have done to white people. The idea that we're monolithic is it's just not historically provable. But there is a tribe of people, a number of tribes that are a nation called Israel, that were in their captivity in that land and were brought to another land in probably the largest exodus that's ever been seen, probably even larger than the one from Mitzrayim that happened mostly in the 1800s. Germans, Irish, English, Scandinavians. When I say Germans, I'm talking about Germanics, because you can boil most of this down to Germanics, so that would include the Scandinavians, and Gauls, which include the Celts, the Angles, and some other pockets of people. That's who was brought here in the most massive numbers of any people moving from one land to another in a period of time that's ever been seen. But we have an issue, and this issue relates to two things. It relates to the land that's being supposed as the land of Canaan, the promised land, and it relates to what is the true, real land, the candidate for Canaan, and much of it has to do with orientation. Orientation is remarkably important, and I've come to find this out through a lot of trial and error studies in the book that I've worked on now for a number of years about the actual geography in the Bible as compared to the geography and topography and climate and etc. of the Levant. What I encountered were a number of passages that contained words that in Hebrew these words are translated as our cardinal directions. There are a few words that are translated as north, mostly two. A lot of times you have to understand there are multiple variations that end up as different entries in concordances, not just Strong's. Multiple concordances do this because all the concordances are basically variations of the same deceptions. So they end up as multiple entries, but oftentimes they're just based on the same root. So you can look at it and you say, all right, well, there's a couple of words that are used for east, mostly a word called zera and a word called kodem. For west, it's mostly yam, but sometimes they use this ma'orabe and mabua as shamash, and we're going to get into that. And then south. South has a number of words that are used for south. A lot of them you can trace to them mostly having to do with actual places. It's just pointing you in the direction of a place. But here's the thing. What I found was when I went to write a chapter on the directions, because it was so vital for continuing arguments about geography, it was really vital to nail down the cardinal directions. Really needed to do that. Now you could argue without doing that, but the problem is I think your argument would not be whole, it would not be complete. What I found while studying all of these various words used and translated as certain cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, is that the only way that I was going to determine whether or not they were correct, and there's enough entries of all of these to determine what one or more is if you have at least one of them absolutely correct and concrete. Then you can determine the rest, because there's enough of them in enough passages to do that. And what I found through a lot of trial and error and testing and thinking this through is that the only way to determine for sure, with absolute certainty, of directions in the Bible, north, south, east, west, is by the movement of the sun. This is how we can tell where we're at. We can get our bearings and our orientation by where the sun is, where it came up, where it sets, where it's at in the sky, the sun. Now, sailors oftentimes use the stars because there's very accurate ways for them to navigate and go certain places by the stars, but the stars' movement themselves helps to tell them exactly if they're going east or if they're going west. It is the movements of the bodies in the heavens that tell us, beyond a shadow of a doubt, what direction we're going. And if we're going to use just our understanding of modern directions, north, south, east, and west, we have to determine, again, beyond a shadow of a doubt, what words in the Bible or phrases, descriptions, definitely, without question, are referring to east and west. We can determine north and south with no problem whatsoever if we have either east or west really nailed. We can get those other ones, not a problem. But we need to understand the sun and passages that have the sun. Now, in the Bible, the sun is a word that is pronounced shamash. Shamash is Strong's H 8120. Shamash appears, it's 8121. I apologize. Now, Shamash appears right around 130 odd times. The interesting thing about Shamash is that it appears with words that describe it. These words describe its movement or what it's doing. There are words that appear in passages with Shamash that are vital in our understanding of whether the sun is, I hate using words like sunrise and sunset. Because, even if we lived on a spinning globe, I don't think sunrise and sunset are very appropriate terms. But let's just say, and maybe this is part of the deception, is this kind of language that's been inserted. The sun coming and the sun receding. The sun breaking day and the sun dissipating in the night. These are possibly far more accurate, better terms concerning the sun than even the ones that we use today. So what I did, I went about looking at all of the passages that the sun occurs in and looking at what verbs and accent words that provide us with detail concerning what the sun is doing so that we can match that up and harmonize it with words that are indicating direction. And once we can do that positively, then we really got our directions down. So what happened was this. There are two words amongst all of the words that there are to be used. There are two that appear most often with the sun describing its movements. Now there's a few others that I'll touch on a little bit, but they don't really carry the weight of these other two words. So understanding these two words and what they really mean, what they're really signifying, is the importance of it is just right there up at the top. And besides that, we also need to understand, for instance, day and night, morning and evening. But we'll start with these two words that are used more than any other words in the Bible to describe what the sun is doing, is ba, that is a simple B and A, ba, which is Strong's H935, and Zera, Strong's H2224. And Zera, it actually occurs oftentimes in many of these passages in a form that simply has an M at the front, which it does not change the root that it's accenting, the M at the front. What it does is it tends to take a concept and turn that concept into more of an instance or thing. It oftentimes has the effect of turning sometimes a noun or an attribute into, a verb or an attribute into a noun. And now there are times when it would appear that it takes a noun and it simply remains a noun. There are a few occurrences where it appears to be a verb. Those are super minority. However, whatever it is that you could argue that it's doing, the one thing that it doesn't do is change the root that it appears before. That root stays the same. So oftentimes zera will appear with the M at the front, and it will be mazera. This is really important too, because this word mazera is actually used specifically as one of the cardinal directions. So we really need to understand that word too. So we've got this ba, and we've got this zera. And mazera is Strong's H4217, by the way. So what we want to do is, before we spend all kinds of time looking at these words and with their relationship to Shamash, sun, we want to look at what is their usage when they're not appearing with the sun. What are they telling us about the movements or location, actions or attributes of the subjects or objects that they're appearing with and that they are describing in other passages? And we'll start with ba, H935. And what we're going to find with ba, passage after passage after passage. Well, let's do this. First off, ba is oftentimes translated as come, bring, in, enter, sometimes go, sometimes carry, down, pass, out, and then miscellaneous many times. But when we start looking at it in context with verses, what we're going to see is just like when the be of ba is used as a prefix on a word, it is indicating that the word that it is connected to, it is bringing it, or it is bringing something to it, close to it, or into it. It has everything to do with proximity. So, for instance, in Genesis 2:19, ba is used, and it says that out of the ground, Yahweh Elohim formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and ba brought them unto Adam. Ba, he brought them unto Adam. So all of those objects he brought to Adam, his subject, or maybe that should be flipped. He's the subject, so the object. The whole point is when you see ba in an object and subject relationship, it is bringing them together. It's not separating. Okay, that's the really important takeaway here. Genesis 2:22, it says, "And the rib which Yahweh Elohim had taken from man, he made woman and brought ba her to the man." In Genesis 4:3, and in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the, and I won't go into the fruit of the ground because I covered that in the episode on Adame. Anyways, it's always indicating a closeness of proximity. Going into, coming near. Always. And it always has to do with the object and subject relationship. Ba is bringing them near, or ba is more appropriately bringing one near to the other. Now this is vital to keep in mind because of how often ba appears with Shamash, the sun. All right? Now, as I said, the other word that appears with Shamash very often is zera. Now, zera is often translated, H2224, as arise, rise up, shine up. But you have to understand something. Both zera, H2224, which only has 18 occurrences, and Masoretes, which has 74, and most of them are translated as the same thing, a certain cardinal direction. They work in the contexts they work within because the whole thing, well, let's just say an entire scheme has been relatively simply developed by a few changes. And as I've illustrated to you many times in the past, that it is not all that difficult to change a simple verb or a noun and just apply that to a context. It's actually very easy. What becomes hard is the fact that the Bible is so diverse in the subject matters that it covers. And since you have these same words appearing in these multiple different contexts, that's why when they changed the meaning and understanding of these words to us, that they had to, for one thing, separate them into multiple different entries in the concordances, and why many of those separated entries have a number of definitions applied. Oftentimes, those definitions can be completely opposite. Why? Because they're trying to deal with the fact that they have radically changed either a noun or a verb or maybe an attribute, and it's all damage control. I've told you this before, that what I believe the modus operandi, like the whole reason that certain things got changed and then why we see so many oddities of problems in translation and the word parsings into different entries into concordances, and then different definitions that are sometimes complete opposites within an entry in a concordance, is because they were changing our perceptions of a certain thing or concept or idea. But then what they had to do is deal with the fact that they wanted to keep this certain word this certain way for this certain amount of passages. They had to cope with the fact that that word was also occurring in a number of other passages. And that's why we see such a disorganized, inharmonious, inconsistent usage of so many words. When you go to the root for zera, zera is a 3-glyph word. Zera could only possibly be one of 2 different roots with an accent glyph. One root possibility is the root is ra, R-H, or rech, rech, with that sort of hard stop to the H, rech. Now, rech in its simple form is H7306, and it's a minority form, oftentimes translated as smell or odor. But more often than that, you'll see rech in its form with the middle U, as in ruch, and that is H7307, spirit, wind, or breath. You'll also see it as riech, as to smell or to touch, having everything to do with airy dissipation. This is breathing. When someone breathes, the breath goes out of them, it's dissipated. The wind blows from a source and dissipates. This is rech. It could be based on that, zerech, the word that we're looking at. I think it's probably more likely based on zer. And we're going to look at zer real quick because I have about 5 or 6 entries of the root zer on this exhaustive OBRY biglyphs roots table. They are H2114, 2115, H2213, 2219, and H5144. And the reason for so many different entries that seem to be all spread out like that is because, again, if a concordance has all of these different entries, you have to look for certain glyphs that are common starters, for instance, for verbs. You'll have E is one, the Y is one, the Ich, that looks like a little hand, and the Jews call Yod in Jubru. You'll have N. Sometimes they'll have those entries with a K at the front, an L at the front, or an M at the front, because those glyphs are indicating like, or they are indicating to, or they are indicating, like I mentioned before, a sort of noun instance of a concept or verb. So what you do is you look at all of the occurrences of a particular word that might have one of those prefixes, or even a suffix like E or T. A T is another prefix that you have to watch out for. You look at all the occurrences of those in the text, and what you'll see is oftentimes you'll see these roots. It appears as these simple roots throughout the text, but they entered it into Strong's or another concordance as a different word with, say, an E, an N, an M, a K prefix or suffix. So all of these entries do use the simple ZR, ZER root. Now, out of these, it is oftentimes translated as stranger, to estrange or wander, to disperse. Sometimes it's used as crown or trim, like the outer dispersion of a thing or a transition from one thing to another. A way to decoratively disperse one object or thing from one plane to another. It is also outright translated as scatter and disperse, separate or consecrate. The root and its cognates, many of the cognates have to do with seed and the broadcasting of seed, not the raising of it. Not the raising of it, but the scattering out of it. So it's important to remember that the overall character of Zera, one of the main words used with sun to tell us how it's moving and what it's doing, the overwhelming evidence contained in the roots for Zer and the cognates for Zer would dictate to us that more often than not, it's telling us that something is scattering, dispersing. I was trying to think of better words, but those are pretty good words. Scattering, dispersing, dissipating. And then with Ba, it is always telling us that one thing is coming near another, no matter what the subject and object relationships are. Now, something I did was I decided to look at these two words since they are the most commonly used words concerning the movement of the sun. I decided to look at these words and see what they looked like in a number of passages where they weren't being used necessarily for the sun, and where they might be appearing in a relationship that was only object-verb. And the reason this is important is, if either one of these words were to appear with the sun, when it comes to the sun, you're not going to have the same relationship as, say, when the text says that Yahweh Elohim brought the woman he had made to the man. You've got an object, you've got a verb, you've got a subject, or subject-verb-object. But not with the sun. Not with the sun. Because there are no passages that say the sun went into, the far distant sky over there, or whatever. That's the problem, of course. But we're seeing these words appearing with the sun, so we have to understand what exactly it's indicating, so that we can start applying that to the verses that these words are in, to see if in fact we have been given the correct movements of the sun, which is the determining core foundational factor of what we consider east or west. Now, Ba is it's so overwhelming in its occurrences. Ba, as it's listed in the concordances, covers at least 2,500 occurrences. So finding it in an object-verb relationship without the subject was actually quite simple. And about 9 or 10 of the examples I came up with were from Genesis alone. Like Genesis 6:17, Ba is used concerning the flood. It says that Ma'bia at Mabul will bring the flood, not will cause the flood to go away. The subject is implied, the subject being the land of Adam kind, or the Adamah. He would bring the flood to the implied object. Also in Genesis 14:13, Uyeba apalit, and came the refugee. Now, the implied object there is he came to the camp of Abraham. But he came. He did not go away from the camp of Abraham. The implied object was the camp. He came. That's why ba is used, because he came near. He came to the camp of Abraham. Genesis 16:8, we have mazeh bat. From what, and it's a question. It's a question that the malak, or messenger, or worker of Yahweh, asks Agar when she is fleeing from the cruelty of Sarah. He says, "From whence have you not gone come?" Because she had come to where he was, that present location. Come. Always bringing the proximity of the subject to the object, or vice versa. Let's just do Genesis 26:32. Yebat obadi Yitzhak. Isaac's servants came. They did not go. They came. The implied object is Isaac or his camp. It doesn't say they came to Isaac. They came, Isaac's servants. Genesis 27:5 would be tzid la ebia, to bring venison, not to take venison away, to bring venison. Genesis 27:33, bateram tabua, before you came, near. Always bringing the subject and the object together. When that ba occurs, it is always bringing two things close together. Ba is even used concerning a man going into a woman, because it's bringing them together. Now, concerning Zerah, Zerah is a neat one because they oftentimes hide Zerah in other words. But you can find Zerah. That's one of the reasons. One of the friends of the OBRY project has helped create these manuscripts from the Masoretico-Critical and from the Westminster Leningrad Codex, or essentially the Masoretic text that's used underlying the King James, and the later Masoretic text that Christian Ginsburg, a so-called converso Jew, created. These OBRY manuscripts were created so that you could do searches on words without the encumbrance of a concordance that was created to steer you in certain directions. You could literally open up one of these in LibreOffice, or you could open it up in Acrobat or another PDF program, depending on if you're using a PDF or if you're using a LibreOffice file, and just search the combination of the glyphs that make up a certain word, which is exactly what I did. And what I found was that Zerah is used in a great many passages. For instance, Deuteronomy 33:2, Yahweh Masini ba uzera meshoir. Now, sometimes this is the Zerah from 2224. And the translation should read, and remember, we have ba in here too. It's not just Zerah, we have ba. Yahweh came, that's the ba, came from Sini, because it's being written from the point of view of being right across from the land of Canaan, or Canaan. Yahweh came from Sini, that's the ba, and dispersed from Shoir. It's really important that you notice the M, which when we have a place or an object like Shoir, the M is telling you that it's from. Okay? So the Zerah can't be indicating that he's coming to Shoir or the rising up, because they have to keep their matrix strong. So they have to, whenever possible, translate Zerah as rising, because Zerah is used often with Shamash and is translated the rising of the sun. But as we see here, it's uzera from, dispersed from shoir. And they translate it as rising because they're trying to keep a consistency. We also have Joshua 7:1. This is where it's describing where Israel encamped after they had crossed the Jordan. They camped outside of a great city called Jericho, or Jericho. It's translated as, or transliterated as Jericho. This actually says Bekatse Mazara Jericho. In the extremity, that's where they were at. They were in the great extremities from the dispersion of Jericho. So a great city, like with an object, when I was describing the ways that zar, the root zer, those two letters Z and R, are used as a dispersion from one thing to another. That's why it's oftentimes translated as a crown, because a crown is a transition or dispersion from one thing to another. Let's see. It's also actually used, and it's quite clever the way they use zera. Zera was more difficult to determine its actual purpose and use, which is why you oftentimes must look at all of the cognates of a certain word that contains a common root, so you can get a better idea of what something means. Now, Joshua 11:8, they oftentimes describe it that Joshua chased these people eastward, but when you look at the text itself, and it says, U'od bakot mitzpeh, mazerahe u'yakam. And if we translate that consistently based on the way that those words occur any and everywhere else in the text, we would come up with something more like, and unto the valley of Mitzpeh dispersed he and smote them. He dispersed and smote them from that place. So a pattern is starting to emerge with zera. Also in Joshua 16:1, describing borders. This is describing the borders of the children of Joseph, so Ephraim and Manasseh. It says, La mi, to the waters, Yirhu, Jericho, Mazera, to the dispersion of the waters of Jericho, where the waters of Jericho disperse. That's where this border went to. It is used actually, this is a really interesting one. It's used in 1 Chronicles 27, verses 8, 11, and 13. And it is also used in 2 Chronicles 31, 14. And I think that's the total of times that they do this. What they do is they take this word, it's zera, and it has a Y at the end, zerahi. And what they try to do is they try to, over and over, say that zerahi is a tribe, a specific, sub-tribe. So from a specific patriarch named Zerah, and they'll say it's these Zerahi. But this is talking about Levites, in particular, talking about Levites, and these Levites in particular don't have any record of any patriarch or father named Zerah. It is only the tribe of Simeon and the tribe of Judah that even have recorded as any sort of sub-tribal patriarch the name Zerah. Same spelling, Z-R-H, Zerah, or Zerach, which kind of makes you wonder where that city gets its name from. Yes, Zurich. Anyways, what you find when you look in, for instance, 1 Chronicles 8, they have to, of course, change it here, and it's its own entry. In this case, it's H3155. They say the Yizerahite. But what you're seeing over and over in the text is that these people did something. They had a certain position that they held. In the first case, when it mentions this Shamhuth, and I really hate the way they transliterate these names. This Shamhuth, it is the Zerah, appears as a verb. He did something. Yezerah. He was a Yezerahi. When you see it again in verse 11, it's mentioning this Sibbecai, the Hushathite. Now, the way it occurs is la zerahi, to do something. That's why it's occurring as la zerahi. And the same thing with 1 Chronicles 27:13. Again, it names a guy. These are all courses of Levites. And again, it says to zerahi, to do something. He did something. Then again, when we see it in 2 Chronicles 31:14, it mentions this Levite or Louis, because Levi's name was Louis, not Levi. Levi is a very Jewy way of saying Louis. Shuor, la mazerahe ol nadbut aliyim. And if we translate those words in a very consistent way, he would be the Louis, as a porter to disperse the volunteers of Aliyim. This is a job. This is somebody who is managing people or things and dispersing them. That's exactly what a manager does. A manager sends people here and there. I mean, just think of that passage when the Roman centurion, if he was indeed Roman, centurion sent to Yusho and said that he was a man who was in charge of a lot of men, and he would order them to go here and there and about. He would disperse them. Zera, disperse. Zera, scatter. Okay? There, we have a consistency. When we translate it as such, it translates back to us in a very clear and consistent way. Now, we have some other passages, like, for instance, in 2 Chronicles 26:19, there is the passage where it says that King Uzziah was going to offer incense in the Beit Yahweh. That's the house of Yahweh, not the temple, the house, just the house. Beit, house. Beit Yahweh. He went to offer incense, which he wasn't supposed to do. That was for the Luim, not the Levites, but the Luim to do. And then it says what happened was this thing, which they call leprosy, it's some sort of plague. It says it's zerahe bu mitzhu. And what they always translate it as is that it rose in his forehead. However, it scattered or dispersed or spread in his forehead is absolutely just as good, perhaps even better, because it didn't necessarily puff or rise, but it scattered, dispersed. Now, we see it again in 2 Chronicles 29:4, where it's describing the part of a street, and it describes it as the mazera, or if we translate it again consistently, it is the dispersion of the street, where the street becomes the sidewalk, the grass, whatever it is bordering on it. There is the portion of the street, some would call it the curb, where the street turns into whatever it is that the street was cut into or placed into, the dispersion of the street. There is Isaiah 43:5. Ani mamazara abiya zerok. And there we have again ba. We have that root ba that occurs here. And if we translate it consistently, all these words consistently, we have, from the dispersion will I bring your seed. Not from the rising. And what they do is they translate it from the east. But we know from many other passages that the children of Jacob, Israel, consisting of the kingdoms of the house of Israel and the house of Judah, would be brought from their dispersion, and their dispersion would be in all directions. So it is more consistent, more accurate, to translate that from the dispersion or the scattering. They were to be scattered, and they were not to be brought from simply one direction, but from the dispersion or the scattering is more consistent. Isaiah 61:3, we have this term olik zerah, over your dispersion or scattering. Daniel 8:9, al-mamazara, towards the dispersion or scattering. And Daniel 11:44, which is really interesting, we could rabbit trail into that hard. It is actually saying, it's ushama'ut abaleu mamazara, and troubling news from the dispersion. And the reason we could rabbit trail into that is because who it's talking about, or the situation that it's describing. However, we do see that when we translate Zerah consistently based on the overwhelming majority of, first off, its roots, and secondly, its cognates, we see that dispersion or scattering is consistent and it's harmonious. We also see with ba, when we test ba, in not only a subject-verb-object or vice versa relationship, but also in the relationship of a subject and verb with an implied object, it always indicates that the one object is drawing near to the implied subject. These things are very, very important for us to keep in mind and determine before we look at all of these passages that we see Shamash or sun in. The last thing that is really important, because we have to look at concretes. We have to look at concretes. Because, for instance, if we were, the first thing I did, which hung me up for a very, very long time, I knew that, for instance, if the sun was indeed rising, it would be morning. If the sun were indeed setting or receding, it would be evening. So I tried looking at the words that are actually translated as morning and evening, Boker and Oreb. One thing I found is that Boker is actually translated as a number of different things, as is Oreb. And we will get into those things later on. But they're not concrete, because for one thing, they're translated in so many different ways. We can't regard them as good concrete sources. But there are a couple of words that we can regard as concrete and that will help us determine whether or not certain things are indeed being said. What we can determine as concrete is found in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 5. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 5, in the King James English, it says, "And God called the light day, and he called the darkness night." Very important. Very, very important. He called light day and darkness night. And the actual, the source OBRY words we've got here is, he called the Aur, light, Yom, day. He called the light day, Yom. And the Hashak, darkness, he called Lile, night. These occur consistently over and over and over again. So from our concretes, we can look at these texts and we can begin to determine if they have been translated to us correctly or not. Those concretes being absolutely definitely ba, as in coming near, coming close to, being with, by, or Zerah is not as concrete because we don't have as many examples, but I would say based on all of the cognates and roots that I showed you, it's pretty darn close to concrete. However, we also have the absolute concrete of light being day, Aur being Yom, day, and Hashak, darkness, being Lile, or night. All of the other words that we're going to see with sun or in context with sun passages, like Boker and Oreb, that are currently translated as morning and evening, they are not concrete. We cannot rely on them. We cannot rely on words like Shahar, which is variously translated as morning or evening, depending on where you find it at, or words like Lin or Lun, Yilin, to lodge or stay, because again, when they feel like it, they'll translate that as evening, night, stay overnight, when in fact it simply means to stay somewhere. And everybody knows if you make camp, you're not only going to be there at night, You could be there for many days. So we can't argue from those non-concretes. We're going to have to look at what is extremely concrete. And we know that for one thing, ba. Ba is extremely concrete. So the first time we see this, the sun in a passage with words that accent it, or verb words, is in Genesis 15:12 and 15:17. So two occurrences in the chapter 15 of Genesis. Now Genesis 15:12, ba occurs, as does it occur in 17 with Shamash. Now keep in mind all of those occurrences of ba and everything I've explained to you about ba. But what we have, according to all translations out there, so since it's all translations that are in on this, in fact, it's, unless you just want more colorful lies, you have to go and start digging in and seeing the way that they have manipulated the text at its source. Because nearly every translation out there is just going to be one variation or another of the same kind of lexicon, concordance, dictionaries that are all established and used in the King James Version. So there's really no big difference between me reading from that and anything else, because they all establish and perpetuate essentially the same lies, like all of them using Egypt for Mitzrayim. Okay, so Genesis 15, I said we started in 15:12 and 17. So in the King James, 15:12 reads, "And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him." And then 15:17, "And it came to pass that when the sun went down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces." That's how every English or anywise other translation reads, essentially, because they all rely on the Jewish Masoretic, the Jewbrew, to interpret and pull their words and the word meanings from. But if we were to take just the source text and translate these words consistently, based on how they occur, especially ba, and the fact that ba is always bringing subject and object close, not separating, but bringing, we would translate this far differently. Genesis 15:12 would say, "And the sun was to come, and unconsciousness fell upon Abram, and behold, great unsure darkness fell about him." And again, Genesis 15:17, "And as the sun was coming and enveloping the moment, and behold, a smoking furnace seething with fire which crossed between," and the last word is a little bit funny too, so I just put in between those grazing. This whole chapter, like I said, I've said in the past concerning Genesis is loaded with entire passages or full chapters that have so many words that are just sourced in dubious entries into Strong's, they're dubious translations. If we translate ba, the attribute or verb that's being used along with Shamash, sun, consistently, the way that ba is used over and over and over again in the 2,500 times that it's just listed as occurring based on Strong's Concordance, if we do it consistently, those two passages do not say the sun was setting, they say the sun was coming, drawing near. Now, what are a few other indications that we can have that we indeed are correct in translating ba along with sun as the sun coming near, thus what we would call sunrise, instead of the way they translate it, sunset? There's a few other things. For one thing, we see in Genesis 15:5 that Yahweh tells Abram to look at the stars when he is having a vision. Now, the root for that has for vision, we see this word hazeh, hazun. That does not mean that he is necessarily hallucinating. Okay? Hazun does not imply he was hallucinating. A vision does not have to be somebody leaving the reality they are in, but simply something inserted into their already aware sight. And I'm sorry, I just hit one of the the hardware on my desk. Anyways, that's all Hazun is. Okay? And Yahweh tells him to look at the stars. The stars are visible in the evening when it's dark. This is very important. In the evening when it's dark. And then he did a number of things which it appears from a more cursory viewing of the text that he perhaps took an animal and separated the pieces and then sat watch over them for quite some time. And he was chasing away not necessarily carrion birds, but the word used there is it's used a lot for actually just circling things. So a lot of things tend to circle around something that's dead, not just carrion birds. There are daytime carrion birds, there are nighttime carrion birds, there are carrion birds that mostly just function in the hours between day and nighttime. However, things that would circle around dead flesh are numerous, and they are active in both the daytime and the nighttime. And again, the word that's used there, it is a dubious word. However, that not to rabbit trail onto that. So he sits with, it would appear, these pieces, according to, again, Jubru translations, for quite some time. And then it says what happened was that as the Shamash, the sun, Ba, and we see it over a couple of thousand times as something drawing near, it said that a deep sleep had come over him. Now, that's in 1512 that it says this deep sleep fell on him. He was extraordinarily tired. Anybody who's been up all night knows that when you get really tired is right in the morning time when the light and the sun are just starting to come up and appear. That you get overwhelmed with and terribly, terribly tired by that time. If you've stayed up all night, now you can overcome that if you just power through that. But that's when people they most commonly get extremely tired, is right around that time. And the last thing, we're going to go back to the concrete. Right after verse 17, where Ba appears with Shamash, is verse 18, and it says, and in that day Yahweh cut a brit with Abraham. So it's brit is translated as covenant. In that day, Yom. We always have to go back to Genesis 1:5. He called the light day the Aur, Yom, and he called the darkness Hashak, Lile, night. That is utterly concrete, and if you look through the occurrences of Yom and Lile, you will see that they are consistent. So in the very next verse, after we see Ba as Shamash, we see in that Yom, and Yahweh called light, Aur, Yom, light. He called Yom. In that day, Yahweh cut Brit with Abram. Now, if in verse 17 the sun was setting, or had set, in fact, because the sun was setting in verse 12, in verse 17, it would have set based on the use of Ba, if we can use it actually as the sun going away, which it's never used in that way in any other occurrence of Ba. But we also have the Olathe, this word Olathe, which if you check all of the occurrences of Olathe, it actually means enveloped. Okay, so if we're going to look at the sun setting, we have to look at that enveloping, so it would be full setting. If that's what it was describing in Genesis 15:17, fully set, enveloped, right? If that was the case, well, then there's no way that it would be Yom. In that Yom, he cut a brit with Abraham. It would be Lile, night. Next is actually the It's the whole description of what happened with Lot at Sodom and Gomorrah. It's Genesis 19. This does not have either the ba or the zera. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because I could. And the problem is, mostly what I would be doing is pointing out to you the very dubious usage of terms like oreb, which is usually translated as evening, or boker, which is usually translated as morning. And this is really just a passage better suited to argue those things. But you will see just a couple of times a verb which is yitza. And I'll just take a minute to tell you this. Anytime that you see simple roots that involve the glyph tsa, you're always going to be looking at almost the complete opposite of what you're seeing with ba. With ba, you're going to see a relationship of a subject and object coming close together. With tsa roots, you're seeing a relationship of subject and object going away from one another. So in Genesis 19:23, even though really every version out there, I don't have to just say the King James, every version out there translates Genesis 19:23 as the sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. Now there's a million reasons why we could go back over this entire chapter, and you could see based on the time passed and what had to be occurring based on certain time cues that we are given in various words, that it would be far more likely that he had entered near sunset. And we're actually going to be tying that in probably at a later point with these words oreb and boker and how they've been mistranslated as morning and evening. But the whole point here is yitzah is the opposite. And what we should be seeing is the sun going out, away from the land. Yitzah, ol eretz. Okay? And as I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that right now. I want to spend most of my time on the passages that mostly involve ba and zera. So next we see it in Genesis 28:11. This is when Jacob was on the run, sort of. His parents definitely told him to go away to Rebekah's brother, so his uncle Laban, in Padan Aram. Now, so here's the whole circumstance. Now, he was put up to deceiving his dad by his mom, but he did capitulate. And the thing is, when Esau found out, he was so angry about this that he figured everybody thought that Isaac was dying. Isaac thought he was dying. He did, but Isaac lived like another 80 or 90 years, but he thought he was dying. And what Esau determined was, he thought, well, my father is ill and he's about to die. I'm going to wait until he's dead and we're done mourning, and then I'm going to kill my brother. So Isaac and Rebekah know what time it is. They understand what's going to happen because of what Jacob has done. And I really get sick of people always blaming this on Jacob. It was his mother's idea. It was his mother's idea. Let's just be clear. I'm not being misogynistic, but it was his mother's idea. However, as I said, he capitulated. He went along with it. He could have refused. So they both bear guilt and blame in that, okay? But Esau's not going to kill his mom. He's going to kill his brother. So he does take off, and I don't think he does necessarily takes off hastily. But the important thing about this passage that we should keep in mind, besides the fact that Shemash's son appears with ba, and ba consistently is bringing one object closer to another object, whether it's stated in the passage or whether it's implied. It is always bringing one object close to another. Now in Genesis 28:11, according to the English, it says, "And he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night, because the sun was set." And that's where we have Shemash and Ba. And they translate it, the sun was set. And he took of the stones of that place and put them for pillows and lay down in that place to sleep. That's awfully translated. It's absolutely awfully translated. When you think about it, first off, give you an indication of how poorly translated it is. How many of you out there, if you had anything to choose from, would choose a stone for your pillow? I don't even care if it was a pillow-shaped stone. How many of you would choose a stone for your pillow? It's a terribly translated passage. This whole, the whole, and it's translated verse, the whole passage is badly translated as well. If we translated it consistently, we would come up with something more like, oh, and keep in mind, these are all mechanical translations, so I didn't really take a ton of time to try to make them nice and frilly and smooth. But if we translated it consistently, it would end up, and he collapsed in a locale and lingered there because the sun had come. And he selected from the materials of the locale and placed his pillows and lay down in that locale. Now, here's the thing. Something I found out, actually, about the early cattle industry in America, livestock industry in America, in areas that were heavily populated with savages. One thing that the cattlemen would do, they would have to do, if they were traveling alone, not with a large group, like maybe if they were pushing their cattle with a large group of men to a certain place, but if they were traveling, and this also worked with anyone who was traveling through savage territory. If they were smart, they would travel by night. They would travel by night, they would sleep by day, because you were more likely to be scouted out by unfriendlies in the daytime than the nighttime. That's why you would travel by night and would sleep by day. This is likely why he constructed a shelter to shelter him from the heat of the day. And for anybody who has slept during the day, you know that you dream during the day. There's no problem there. The problem comes when you start reading these things in the common translated English, all from the Jewbrew. And you start seeing things like, let's see, give you a good example. This actually also occurred in the account with Lot, but I didn't want to linger on that. There should be, actually in that verse, let me look real quick. There it is. It is in that verse. And in the English, let me see how that reads. There it is. When it says he lighted on a certain place and tarried there all night. That's what really throws you. Because then you see Ba Eshemash and you say, well, it has to be the sun setting. It just has to be, right? Because it says right there, and he came to a certain place and he tarried there all night. Well, then it has to be the sun was setting. Because it said he tarried there all night. No, it doesn't. It certainly does not say that. No, what it says is that he came to a place, it says, Uyipago, so he entered into a makum, a place. Uyilan Shem. Uyilan Shem. He camped there. That's all that means. He camped there. He stayed there. That's it. It does not tell us it was night. It does not tell us it was day. It tells us that he set up camp to stay there. That's all it tells us. But since they are trying to build up, strengthen, and keep this narrative that they have imposed upon the text, when they could easily just tell us that he camped there, which doesn't tell us it's day or night, they specifically and purposely translate he tarried there all night. Now, how deceptive. Why would you intentionally, deliberately use deceptive language like that, lest you were trying to strengthen an unnatural narrative? Okay, so the next one is Genesis 32, and this is Panuel. It is worth looking at for sure. But again, this whole narrative of Genesis chapter 32 and Panuel, absolutely full of a lot of dubious terminology. This is where as per the translations, Jacob wrestled with a man and so on and so forth. All right, we're mostly just going to concentrate on one or two verses, time frames, and what some very particular wording should tell us. So the actual text itself is the first time we're going to see this word zerah with Shamash. And the OBRY actually reads u yezerah, so it's actually using zerah in a verb form. To him, lu, es Shamash. Ka'asher, ober at panuel, u ewa tselo ol yiriku. So if we translate that consistently, and I don't want to get into the last part of that because there's a question about what actually happened to him, this man that he, as they translate, wrestled with, because the word they translate as wrestle only appears a couple of times. But anyways, I don't want to get too far into that. But if we translated it consistently, if we translated zerah consistently, it would be, and scattered or dispersed to him the sun. And then we would go to the as which he crossed Penuel simultaneously in turning and his weak spot, and forget the rest of that. Very dubious stuff. But let's just look at that. And this, it's scattered to him the sun, scattered. A couple of things about that. First off, lile, which is extremely concrete, just like yum, day, lile, night. Very concrete, because he called the darkness night. That occurs much earlier in this chapter. It occurs in verses 13, 21, and 22. Because during that time, he's actually separating out a lot of his various animals into groups. He's sending out his men in two different groups with all of these different separated animals that he's chosen out to give as a gift to his brother Esau into these groups, sending them forward to go and meet Esau. And he's also separating up his family into two bands and putting them in different places. And it says he began doing this at night, which would take him actually quite some time. Now, the interesting thing is after we see him doing all of this throughout the night, which would take a considerable amount of time, then in Genesis 32:24, this is where it says that he wrestled with a man until, and I guess in the English, most of the time, most of the time it says, of course I'm not on the verse, most of the time it says until the breaking of day. Until the breaking of day. And the actual words that they translate from is olut and shahar. And it's really important to look at shahar, because that's a very pivotal passage for us to look at this word shahar. Now, the funny thing about shahar is this. Now, they'll say the breaking of day. Okay? But when you check the other occurrences of shahar, and shahar is H7837. When you just look at some of the other entries, because shahar is also entered as 7836, it's entered as 7838. In 7836, you can see it used as either early or bedtimes. Bedtimes. That's not morning. Now, even though it's used as morning and day about altogether 18 times, that's 18 times it's used as morning and day as H7837. However, when we get to H7838, it's translated as black, as in dark, 6 times. In H7836, it's translated as bedtimes, 3 times. And it's translated in a number of other ways. Okay? What we want to do, for one thing, is we want to look at the root. The root would be shah. The R at the end is a very, very common prefix, used in quite a similar way as the way we use OR and ER as a suffix. Did I say prefix? It's a suffix. As we use ER and OR today. Plumber, doctor, that sort of way. It has that sort of effect on either a verb, a noun, or an attribute. So we'll go to shah. Its root and check out the way that Shah is used. Now, I have two root forms of Shah here. It's H7807 and 7808. And they're only, both of them, just one occurrence. 7807, the one occurrence, is translated as lowly. And then 7808 as thoughts. But if we look at its cognates, I've got about 10 of its cognates listed. H3445, Yisha, a sinking feeling. Now, H4886 through 88, it is Masha or Mashahe, which is oil, smear, or cover. In H4889, 92, and 93, it's Mashahit, destroy, or corrupt. In H6582, Pasha, one occurrence, pull in pieces, or probably more accurately, muted. 7811 through 13 is Shaheh. It appears 175 times as swim, be engulfed, or to bow down and prostrate oneself. It's used in 7815 Shahur as coal or darkness, and is actually compared to the Hashak, darkness, that we saw in Genesis 1:5. He called the darkness night. It's used as Shahut a number of times and translated pit. And Shahah, H7817, bow down or cast down. 7818 through 20 is Shahat, press, kill, or beat. Everything giving you the idea of suppression, lowly, covering, darkness. All of it. So when we go back and we look at a verse that's setting the scene as far as Jacob wrestled with him until Olut Shahar. Now, based on everything we've seen concerning Shahar, it is far more likely that it should be translated as a covering of darkness, a lull, than morning light or dayspring. Given the fact that we see that in verse 24, then we can go back to the verse in question that has that word, Zerah, in it, and see that when it's translated as, and the sun scattered or dispersed, when we see that he wrestled with a man until the Shahar, then this scattering or dispersing of the sun makes absolute, complete, harmonious sense. Now, the next verse that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because it's like Yitzah, where it has a word that is sort of minority usage with sun. I want to point out a couple of things. This is Genesis 16. Now, or Exodus 16. Now, the chapter Exodus 16, it does actually contain a number of occurrences of boker, which is translated as morning. It does have a number of occurrences of yom, which is a very concrete day word. It does have a number of occurrences of lile, which is a concrete night word. It has at least like 4 occurrences of oreb, which is translated as evening. However, here's the problem. This is sort of the problem that you're going to see just about all the way through the law, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, especially in precepts of the law, is that oftentimes when you see these precepts of the law, morning or evening could be very easily swapped, and you don't have any definitive answers. And the same with Exodus 16:21, and I am going to talk a little bit about some of the other content occurring in Exodus 2, but specifically Exodus 16:21, this is where Shamash occurs, and it occurs with the word ham. Now, ham more often than anything tends to allude to mixing, or more appropriately, in a sense like churning, which could absolutely imply warming. Could. I can't say for sure, but that would be my best, based on all of the different occurrences of ham and whom and things like that, okay? It's relatively safe to say that you could figure ham for mixing or churning, which essentially creates friction, which warms. We know that. However, the passage that Shamash occurs in, it reads, essentially the word that is used is that there was collection being made. And this is all referring to this min. Now, I have serious doubts about this min necessarily being like a sort of breadcrumb that was on the ground. Why would you want to eat these breadcrumbs that you had to pick up from the ground? You're going to be getting dirt and all other kinds of things in them if you have to pick up these small little bits and pieces of something like a breadcrumb from off the ground. A breadcrumb, a naked breadcrumb or morsel, small morsel, because that's the idea that we're given, from off the ground. And if it was there when the dew receded, it would be soaked as well. It would be a mess. There are words used throughout Genesis 16. They're not trustworthy. One of them is the word that is translated as dew, thal. And the reason is you can go and check thal throughout the Bible, and you can see all the time that thal has to do with heaven. Dew doesn't come from heaven. Okay? Yet thal appears over and over again as coming from heaven. Thal, from heaven. Dew doesn't come from heaven. Dew is a condensation from earth. It doesn't come down from the sky or heaven. That's one thing. Another thing is the words that are actually used to describe this min. And the fact that this min, that's what they translate manna. Min. It really is just indicating something from. It's a thing from. It's a thing from Yahweh, this min. So all of these descriptions about this min seem to indicate that what was happening is this was something that was left. And this was a regular occurrence. I'll use the term daily, but I'm not using it in the same way that the Bible uses the term daily. But this was a daily occurrence, okay? Every 24 hours we read, except Sabbath. The day before Sabbath, you were expected to collect double. There are verses within chapter 16 that describe shalu, which they translate as quail, as coming at a certain time, and then this min being left at a certain time. When you consider the fact that boker and oreb, being so dubious and being used in so many different ways, can be swapped a lot, you don't have any concrete answers as far as did the quail come in at evening like they translate it as, or did the quail come in the morning? Now, I've kept birds, and they're typically the most active in the morning. I don't know how active, flocks are, or flocks of quail are in the morning as compared to the evening. But that would be important to know. There are wild flocks of quail, actually, that travel all around the U.S. Just throwing that in there. Let's see. And the other thing is that it says, so there's a passage that says they were told to not leave that min, whatever it is, this provision that they would get, until the next boker. Remember, boker is translated as morning, because what it said was that if they left it until the next boker, it would breed worms, get mealy and nasty. One quick thought on this passage before I move on to things that are a lot more concrete and have a lot more to do with Ba and Zerah is the fact that a food or foodstuffs that is actually sitting, if it's extremely perishable, sitting throughout the day, and the heat of the sun is more likely to go bad in the heat and in the humidity of day than it is to go bad simply over the coolness of night. So that's just another thing. But what we mostly want to focus on is these passages because they're pretty overwhelming and they're extremely concrete and they say a lot more to us. The passages that have Ba and Zerah along with sun. So next is Exodus 17:12. So in Exodus 17:12, this tribe who was a subtribe of Esau, or Edom. They were named Omlak. That was one of his grandchildren. They became a separate, distinct tribe. They are transliterated into Amalek. So Omlak, it says in Exodus 17:8, then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said unto Joshua, choose out men, go out and fight with Amalek. Now, it says, tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. This whole passage is again full of words that we see translated in different ways at different times. The mahar is one of those words. So we just saw that in that verse where it says, mahar, tomorrow I will stand on the hill, when in fact, in verse 9, the mahar need not be tomorrow, but many har roots have to do with fierceness, the sword, burning, etc. And think about this. Why would Omlak or Amalek be polite enough to wait until tomorrow? They just attacked Israel. I don't think they're going to attack Israel and then say, okay, well, the sun is setting, so let's just go ahead and wait until the next day for them to regroup and have their act together and provide a better defense and offense against us. I think that it's kind of insane to think that they thought like that. They specifically attacked Israel in their rear flanks, and they meant business. And Israel had to get right to work to fight against them. Now, a more likely logical account would be that Amalek attacked Israel. Upon learning this, Moses said to Yehusha, Joshua, to get good men and take the fight to Omlak. This is precisely what he told him to do. They're just translating that mahar as tomorrow. To go take the fight to them as he climbed a nearby hill to oversee the battle. No gaps. This is all happening consecutively. And they fought until the sun came. It can't be said they weren't fighting at night, because there's further action after verse 12. So either way, they would have fought at night. Whether you want to make Ba Eshemash, the sun going down, or not, you have them fighting at night. And people frequently fought at night. Into our very own modern times, they fight at night. Night can oftentimes be used in a very advantageous way by a combatant force. So when we see in Exodus 17:12, in the English version, it says, and Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone, they put it under him, and he sat thereon, and Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side and the one on the other side, and his hands were steady until, and then they translate Ba Eshemash, the going down of the sun. However, if we translate Ba consistently, we would have until the sun came. We're looking at huge populations of people, and we're looking at something that was very large. Them moving alone would have covered a few square miles, I kid you not, and they wouldn't be moving in a big, wide, broad circle. They would all be following a road, so they would be a very long company. So if Amalek comes and they attack Israel at one of their flanks, they would have to get everyone together, and they would have to essentially group these fighting men together so that they could mount an offensive towards Amalek. Moses would have had to have gotten on a hill in that time, and then they would have had to have fought Amalek. Sorry, I just accidentally hit my mic because I'm talking with my hands. They would have had to have fought Amalek. And this would have been something that would have been consecutive and ongoing. So it makes perfect sense that they fought Amalek until the sun came again. And one thing of additional interest is before this in Exodus 17, it has the account that when they got to Rephidim, that the people were complaining about the lack of water. And so this is the account where he strikes this tsur, not slo. Slo is boulder. Tsur is more like a sheer face. And it cracked and water came out of it. But it was their chiding and their complaining and their threats towards Moses that if you just read and pay attention to the account, this is what likely brought on the attack of Amalek. And we see all of this going on likely during the day when they're gathering there for the water and all of this stuff. This would be a very common thing for this to happen, this assembly of the people and so on and so forth during the day. And there's nothing that tells us that there was any kind of great period, small period of time between that happening and Amalek attacking. So again, it is perfectly reasonable to believe that Amalek attacked them after this incident because of their behavior, which then again, very likely would have happened towards the close of the day. And from this point forward, this is where we start getting into a lot of points of law, where I pointed out to you, there's this huge amount of verses where we would find things like Boker and Oreb, translated as morning and evening, which you could very easily swap the two. However, I'm going to point out a few passages to you. One of them actually being, Exodus 22:25. The way that this has been translated, this is Exodus 22:26, one of the points of law. The way it's translated in English is, if thou at all take thy neighbor's raiment to pledge, thou shalt deliver it unto him by that the sun goeth down. Okay? Now, this is one of the passages that we are going to see ba eshamash. And we actually see it with od. So od is pretty much, it's always going to be unto or until. Od ba eshamash. And then after this, we have this interesting word. We have teshibnu lu. Now, I looked into this, and I looked into all of the wording in this passage. And then I thought about this passage quite a bit. So, one thing that helps to sell this passage as actually saying what they tell us it says is the idea that, and I've heard teachers, preachers teach on this. And what they'll tell you over and over again is that men would sleep in their coat. They needed their coat to sleep in. And that's why if you took pledge from them, if you took their coat as pledge, you needed to give it back to them by sunset because they slept in it. It doesn't quite do it for me. Typically, we would sleep in blankets. And we had everything necessary to have plenty of blankets. We left Mitzrayim with all of our things. We had wagons full of things. We had our possessions and our belongings. In general, as a rule, from that point, we left with all of our belongings. We would have had blankets. We would have had mats and other things to sleep on and so on and so forth. And most of these laws, in general, were laws that were to be given and used on a long-term basis, especially when we were in the land and settled. They were most specifically to be implemented once we were settled in the land. So the idea that we would still be sleeping in our raiment in the land, it really doesn't jive with reality very well. Now, going through this passage, taking all of the words in this passage and translating them very consistently, and keep in mind, there are a ton of words that are translated as pledge. There are a ton of words that are translated as usury. There are a ton of words that are translated as surety. That is always a bad sign. It's always a red flag. Now, I translated all of these words to the best of my ability and kept them all as consistent as I possibly could. And what I came up with for this passage is something more along the lines of, if you should disturb the peace of your neighbor until the sunrise, you should make it up to him. These are essentially ordinances concerning the noise that you make and how it is affecting your neighbors. The making up to him could be monetarily. It could be a number of ways. But we have laws to this day concerning noise ordinances. And all you have to do is consider what makes the most sense. That we were Stone Age morons and didn't have blankets, which we would have had because we left with all of our stuff. These laws were mostly intended to be kept in the land when we were settled and had our own homes and our own things. Does it make more sense that we would still be sleeping in our coats, or that we would be sleeping in beds with blankets, and that the idea of taking a coat so that you didn't have something to sleep in would actually apply? Or that a common law, a very sensible law, that if you disturb your neighbor until the sun comes up, which plenty of people who are degenerates and party all night do, you actually owe them. Tell me, which law makes more sense? The way that they translated according to Jubru, or the way I just told you it ought to be translated based on a consistency of translation of all of the words therein, including Ba-Eshamash, which would be the sun coming, not going. Now, starting in Leviticus 22:7, we have a whole set of passages that concern somebody being clean or unclean, and when they are unclean until. Now, in most of the English versions, Leviticus 22:7 is going to read something like, "And when the sun is down, he shall be clean, and shall afterward eat of the holy things, because it is his food." Now, I could probably bounce through, and now it is using the word ba for the sun, okay? And we know that in the 2,500 times that ba is used, it's bringing the subject and object close, not separating them. And you have to consider, what makes more sense? Does it make more sense that someone who is unclean by whatever it was that they did, and as I said, there's a whole subset of these laws and specifications of things that one might do to wind up unclean, that they are in this state of uncleanness until a certain time. Now, again, this is where these words boker and oreb come in, which again we'll approach later after we've gone through mostly these ba and zera passages. But does it make more sense that someone would be unclean until evening, and then they would go in amongst the other people? Essentially, they're saying that they need to stay away from others, clean themselves, and at this time, they're clean, and they may come amongst others, and they may eat. The eating part is really important. We're going to see that again later. To me, it makes more sense that they would be clean, fresh, and appropriate to come amongst others upon the sun coming up and it being the new day. And we're going to see that reinforced in a number of other passages. One of the most telling passages, it's again a set of passages, are concerning sex. So, and basically things having to do with whether it's ejaculation or whether we're talking about the secretion of blood and fluids for a woman, or of the fluids from a man. We're talking about the sexual organs and any sort of expulsion of anything from those organs. Again, this law would apply, and similar terms are used as far as being unclean to this certain time, and they wash, then they can go among others. And when you consider when most sex and excretions happen, and just common sense should lead you to conclude that it makes far more sense that they would be, again, clean, wash themselves in the morning, and then be suitable to go amongst others. So, continuing along now. Now, there are a number of passages after this in both Deuteronomy and in Joshua that I'll have to skip for now because they use Masorah with Shamash, but the thing is, it's specifically just indicating a direction. So it doesn't have any other descriptive words around these passages typically. So they're not going to be very helpful for us right now. We're going to have to just circle back around to these. The next passage, though, that is really helpful and instructive is Deuteronomy 16:6. This one is pretty important because it has to do with instructions for the Passover. And what's most useful about this one, besides the fact that we do specifically have ba with Eshamash, it says ka bua Eshamash, as bua Eshamash, and we know that consistently ba is anything coming near or drawing near. And it also says be'oreb. And as I've already mentioned, oreb is always translated as evening, but I don't think that is correct. And when you change the coming or the going of the sun, you also have to change the morning and the evening. So let me go over a few things that are important in this, because this is just a small verse or two in Deuteronomy 16, but we have a lot described in Exodus 12, the first Passover, all the descriptions for that. The one thing that is interesting is when we look at it, Exodus 12, Deuteronomy 16, 6 and 7 will make more sense. So in Exodus 12, one of the first things that stood out to me is that what it says in Exodus 12:6 is, "You shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation." This is when you would take a sheh, which can be a lamb or a goat, and you would keep it until the 14th day of that month. The whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it, and what the English typically says is in the evening. And the problem is it's a really bad translation because it's not consistent. The actual words are bin et orabim. Now, if they want to keep oreb evening and orabim evenings, they're not translating bin consistently, because bin, B-Y-N, bin, is always translated as between. Absolutely always between. Bin appears in its first occurrence in Genesis 1, describing the space that is between the Rikio and the land. Bin absolutely is indicating something between. And in fact, I think that's where we get our modern word between from, is this word, bin. So consistently translated, it would be between the orabim. And then if they want to keep orabim evening, the problem is this wouldn't work. Or if they want to keep orabim evening and Bakar morning, what we would end up seeing in this description of what was to be done with the Passover is that you would have to take it in and process it more likely than just the word kill. The operative word that's being used is shahath, and I'm pretty sure that is it's also in Exodus 12:6. Shahath. Shahath is translated a number of times, about 80 times variously, as kill, slay, offer, shoot, or slaughter. But it does have a number of other occurrences in which it's simply saying that whatever the thing it's talking about. So it's translated other times as pressed or beaten, and the subject matter would lead you to believe that what you're doing is you're preparing, you're processing or preparing whatever said thing. And based on all of its cognates, they would suggest that as well. So I'm not saying that it wasn't killed, but if we were being instructed to do this between the evenings or mornings, and what I'm posing is that OREB is actually morning, and I'm going to show you more evidence of that. That would give appropriate time between the evenings or between the mornings, because that would be a full 24-hour period of time. And the reason that's important is because when I was looking at all of this, I went and looked into the slaughter of an animal. We're going to say a 2-year-old lamb or goat, which is a pretty good-sized animal if it's 2 years old. To slaughter it appropriately, then you need to hang it. You'd slaughter it. You'd have to hang it to drain a little bit, and then you would begin processing it, because you have to roast it whole. So when you hang it, and somebody who's very good at skinning would then skin it, but this is going to take them a bit of time to do that. We're probably looking from slaughtering to draining to just skinning. That's going to be a couple hours right there, at least right there. And then getting it prepped to go on some sort of spit, and then getting it on the spit and then roasting it. If you roasted it just horizontally on a spit, a full-size lamb or goat, that's going to take you a good 4 hours. A good 4 hours. However, in this whole long passage of Exodus 12, we also see, we also see that based on the description of how it is supposed to be roasted, that description suggests that it would be roasted in a vertical position. So you have to put it on a stick or stake, upright, vertically, and roast it like that. Now that might actually take even longer, but even if it didn't, if we're just looking at a horizontal roast, okay, that's a good 4 hours. So from the time that you take it, you kill it, you drain it, you take the skin off of it, and there are a few more things that you want to do before you actually roast it. You are going to want to disembowel it, and then the rest of it can pretty much stay all together when you get it on the stake, prepare it for roasting, and then it has to be roasted whole. And roasting a whole 2-year-old lamb or goat does take a number of hours to do. And then at that point, once you have it ready, all the men were supposed to eat this in ready position. They were supposed to be standing up, prepared and watchful, eating it with other specified food items. And then the thing is, and here's why they would get tripped up no matter if they apply evening to OREB and morning to Bokeh or what. Because in another verse, in Exodus chapter 12, it does say that you have to get rid of everything. Well, okay, first off, let me go here. Verse 8 it dictates that the eating of it is to be done in the night. All right? Because it's lile. And lile is one of our really concrete terms where we can tell exactly what time it is and what's going on. Because in Genesis 1:5, the light is called Yum and the darkness is called lile. So it also specifies in 2 different verses that there can't be any remains of this, of anything you've done, or the Passover, which, you can't don't break its bones or anything like that, but you have to dispose of it in a proper way by Bokeh. So even if they wanted OREB to be evening, they completely disregard the bin, so it would be between evenings, if OREB was indeed evening. And then you would be disposing of it by morning, so then by the next morning, not within that 24-hour period, but by the following morning. If they want to keep OREB and Bokeh as evening for OREB and morning for Bokeh, okay? Then at least they would need to do that, which they don't even do that. So here's why it's really important. I've heard people struggle for years now in trying to harmonize what happens in the Gospels with this, with what's dictated to happen in the Passover. The problem is things don't tend to completely harmonize. I've heard people make a lot of excuses. A lot of folks will actually go to rabbinic writings to try to harmonize this whole idea of what happened in what time frame, and for instance, why Yusho was killed the following day, because they would keep Passover on Passover. It wasn't like an option. Everybody would have to keep Passover at the appointed time, and then he was killed the following morning. But consider something. I'll go to Matthew, and it's in a couple accounts where we can see what's going on. But just real quick from Matthew, it says in Matthew 26:17, the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, "Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover?" So the first day of unleavened bread is Passover. That's when Passover starts. And notice if Matthew was indeed translated from OBRY, and I absolutely believe that it was, it has all kinds of signs as far as the sorts of terminology that's used in it, and the fact that Matthew alone has a really large amount of transliterated words in it. Just the feel for it in general, if you spend enough time reading in OBRY, you know that essentially it's just another language that's using the same sorts of expressions and oftentimes syntaxes, and then you have all of those transliterations. But it does say the first day, and we know that the light is day. Of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first day would be Passover. The disciples came to him and they said, where shall we prepare this? Because they're getting ready to. It's the first day. And he says, go to the city to such a man and say, my master says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples. So when that day had come, in that morning, he tells them that they need to go somewhere to prepare this, because they had to do all of this. Or they might have actually been taking it with this guy, and he would have to be preparing it during the day, because it takes quite a long time to prepare this whole thing. And that's why it's between the Orabim, because there's time. We never seem to stop and consider time, the time anything takes to be accomplished. And then in verse 19, and the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them. They made ready the Passover. And that term, made ready, is what I'm telling you, that shahath, that word shahath, is more likely saying something like that, making ready. And you can consider the making ready as the killing, the hanging, the skinning, the gutting, and then the getting it on the proper spit and then roasting it in the proper way. And now it says, now when even was come, he sat down with the 12. Now that's the first problem. Because if Oreb was indeed evening, like they try to make it out in the Old Testament, they would have began the preparation at evening. They did not. They began the preparation in the morning, on the first day of unleavened bread. That's one reason why we should be looking at Oreb as morning instead of evening. Then we have him eating this the Passover with his disciples, as was instructed to do in Exodus 12, at night. And then after they ate this, what did they do? He brought them out to the garden and he told them to keep watch. That's what the men of Israel were to do. On the night of Passover, they were supposed to eat that at night. See, there's a reason why. It wasn't arbitrary. They were to eat it at night, and then they were to keep watch. So if Oreb is morning, as I'm posing that it is, they would have begun this whole process in the morning, like we see in the Gospels. They would have ate it and kept watch in the night, just like in Exodus 12. And then here's the thing. So at night is when he's taken. and his bogus trials occur, and they end up, they beat him and everything else, and this is all taking time. This is all taking time. You can't even begin to try to start preparing a Passover in the evening and then have everything that transpired before he's finally put on his execution stake, an execution stake, upright, just like as described in Exodus 12, the way that the Passover was to be prepared, upright. In order to get him on his execution stake by the next day, there are too many things that had to transpire for any of this to begin in the evening, for them to begin to prepare the Passover in the evening. That's why, of course, they began the preparation of it in the morning. And the really interesting thing is this. It is commanded in Exodus 12 that everything having to do, the Passover animal itself, the sacrifice itself, you're not to break any of its bones or anything, but you're to dispose of it. And in there it says burning it, I believe, or it gives options. But the whole point is everything having to do with the preparation of the Passover that you've done between the Oribim, it has to all be disposed of the following Boker. Again, I know I'm being repetitive, but I feel like it's just so important to be here. Okay? They say Orib is evening, they say Boker is morning. But again, we just saw in the Gospels, they would have had to have begun all of this in the morning, and between the morning and next morning is when all of this would occur. And then if Boker is indeed evening, by the evening, everything had to be disposed of. Everything, which would be the animal, possibly the steak, but especially the animal. If Boker is evening, it would have to be disposed of by the evening. And, of course, we know that Yeshua was killed during the day. And then this Joseph of Arimathea, as he's called in the New Testament, begged his body to get it in the ground before the evening. He was put in the ground by evening. So, if we look at Orib as morning instead of evening, we look at Boker as evening instead of morning, the whole description from Exodus 12 harmonizes very smoothly and easily with the gospel accounts of the sacrifice, the death, and the putting in the ground of the Messiah from the Gospels. The time frame now, if we understand that Ba Eshemash would be the coming son, that harmonizes from Deuteronomy 16:6. That, of course, harmonizes with Exodus 12, where if we see Orib as morning instead of evening, that this would all be done from the first morning to the second morning. We have a 24-hour period. The eating of it and the watching would be done during the night. And then you would have until the next evening to get the Passover disposed of, as is exactly what we see being described in the Gospels in that time frame. In the Gospels, again, the first day of unleavened bread, which is the Passover, is the first day of unleavened bread, began the day, the light is day. It begins in the morning. They go about preparing the whole thing. They have the light of day to do this in. Then at night is when they begin the whole process of eating and standing guard, which is exactly what they did in the gospel. And then he is taken, has his bogus trials, and is put up on his execution stake by sometime early the next day. He dies on that day, probably far more from the infliction of a lot of his wounds, but also the trauma of the execution stake they put him on. And then, to make sure it harmonized very well with the Old Testament, if we understand that Ba Shemash is the coming son, and if we understand that Boker is evening and Orib is morning, it harmonizes exactly with the Old Testament account. And we have a complete harmony that we don't have to wonder about, argue over, seek rabbinical counsel on. We have harmony between the dictation of how the Passover was to be kept and what we see happening in the Gospels. So that passage is really important. Now, further on, there's a real bit of smooth translating that goes on in the next couple of reference verses here with sun. It's found in Deuteronomy 24, verses 13 and 15. Now, in general, I don't think these are translated all that great. Let's see here. I believe I did comment on this. Yeah. I did this in another verse, actually, just before this. This is, again, in reference to somebody's pledge and the idea that somebody slept in their coat. Although the law was meant for us to be observing once we were in the land, you wouldn't have to sleep in your coat. You'd have a bed, you'd have blankets, and they probably had beds, cots, blankets out in the wilderness since they took pretty much all of their things with them when they left Mitzrayim. But the other thing that's actually quite interesting is in Deuteronomy 24:15. In the English it reads, "At this day you shall give him his hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it, for he is poor." It has to do with paying a man his wages the day he works. That's the idea of a day laborer. You pay them that day. But if you translate that consistently, it would say, "In his day you give his wage, and not let come over him the sun. For weary is this one, and to him the same burden as his soul." If you translate it consistently, what it is saying is you will pay him in the day he works. His work would be done. Typically, most of this work would oftentimes be done at the end of the day, the time of light, the day. And you would pay him while that day still lasts. At the end of the day, the sun is going away, and you're commanded not to let the sun come upon him, which would be the following morning, and him still not have his pay. But again, as you can see with the sort of very subtle and sometimes not so subtle tweaks of the text they use, they manipulate the text to say something quite different. When they're putting it, the way they're translating it as the coming of the sun, or ba eshemash, if they want to say it's sundown, it's a sort of separate phrase. And in Deuteronomy 15, they make it as an accent phrase, in a sense, when they translate, "At his day you shall give him his hire, and neither shall the sun go down upon it." Whereas if you just do a straightforward reading of it, it says, "In the day he works, you give him his wages. Do not let the sun come upon him without his wages being paid." Sun coming is the next morning. Deuteronomy 33:14 is pretty much another one where they have to change the aspects and not translate consistently. I hope one thing I'm accomplishing in going through all of these is that it will become clearer and clearer to everyone listening to this that why so many verses. If you look at the wording of these verses and you notice that the translation's so inconsistent, it's so odd. Probably the leading reason for that is because there were a number of things that they needed to change to fit the agenda that they had in mind, whatever that may be. And that those changes ended up affecting so many verses that now had to be toyed with quite a lot to make all of this work and harmonize. So Deuteronomy 33:14 in English, it reads, "And for the precious fruits brought forth by the sun, and for the precious things put forth by the moon." This is simply part of a blessing. But that's what they say it has to say in their translations to make all of this work. The text, in fact, is pretty simple and pretty straightforward, and it has this verb, ba, in the form of tabu'at. So first off, we have it in the plural, and the T at the front would seem to indicate something that is to happen. And if we read it quite simply, it says, and the greatly anticipated coming of the sun, and greatly anticipated phasing moons. That makes total sense. Absolute sense. As opposed to, and for the precious fruits, which is not even in there. The precious fruits brought forth by the sun, and the precious things put forth by the moon. It's inconsistent. They, of course, have to change this. Why? The reason they have to change this is because if they translated it consistently, they would have to say, the precious fruits of the sundown, the going away of the sun. That really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. This is why they have to do these things. And so oftentimes when we look at these verses, we see these really bizarre translational decisions that they would appear to make, or lexiconic decisions, in the sense that they would take one entry of one word and use it in so many various ways. When we understand what they have to do to make a certain concept work that they have inserted, terminology that they have changed, this is a big reason why they have to do this. So the next one is interesting because there are two passages that are similar, where Joshua defeats a king in one passage and then kings in another. And they are hung on trees, and I will read you the English. It's Joshua 8:29. The English reads, and the king of Ai he hanged on a tree until eventide. And as soon as the sun was down, Joshua commanded that they should take his carcass down from the tree and cast it at the entering of the gate of the city, and raise thereon a great heap of stones that remains unto this day. When we see the fact that the verb that's used in this passage is, again, it's bua, so ba eshamash, translated consistently, the coming of the sun. We see that the actual text reads od, ot, oreb, u, ka, bua, shamash. And we know how they translated it. I just read it. But if we did this consistently, and oreb was morning instead of evening, we would see that he hung him on a tree until the time of as the coming of the sun. He commanded that his body should be taken down, taken to these gates of his city, raised a big heap upon it. And what you have to consider in that, when we apply these more consistent and concrete terms to this and turn this into, they hung his body on a tree, and then in the morning, at the coming of the sun, he commanded all these things be done. Now, things in the Bible do happen at night. Battles happen at night. There is harvesting that would appear to occur at night, which is not an odd thing either. The more I ended up having to learn about, let's just say, if certain things were viable, because there were some odd passages I did come across where I thought, well, this would appear to be saying that somebody was working on their field or harvesting at night. And that's really weird. That wouldn't be. And then I would have to go and research it and find out that harvesting at night is actually a common thing, because it is cooler at night and there's less insects at night. And actually a number of farmers do harvest through the night. That's not a weird thing. It's a pretty normal thing. So anyways, there are a lot of things that do occur at night. But since we know that ba is consistently the coming close of, and that's used with the sun, and as I suggest to you, oreb should be morning and not evening, it does make all the sense in the world that when the morning came, he would command his body be taken down. Why? Because his body would begin to stink. As the sun rose up and started causing all of those wonderful things to happen in a piece of dead flesh that the sun causes to happen, all of that that life and decay that the sun is going to cause. See, overnight, that wouldn't happen. His body would be far more preserved overnight. But as the sun rose and it shone on him and the warmth came, then some pretty unpleasant things would start happening with the body. So it does make a lot of sense that that would happen. He would command that in the morning. And he told them to do a number of things which I would pose to you would be quite difficult things to do at night. Bringing his body to the gates of the city in the way he commanded the body to be treated would be a lot more difficult to accomplish those things at night than the day. So it does make sense. But the next passage that's really interesting is in Joshua 10. Joshua 10 is the account of the battle that he had near Gibeon. And this is where he asks for the sun to stand still in the sky. And I'll read just a bit of it to you to show you how interesting this is, because one thing we have is we have that concrete term lile, and we know that lile is consistently night, so it is dark in lile. But let me read you how they do this. So Joshua is coming with the armies of Israel to make war on these kings, okay? And let's see, I guess starting in Joshua 10:8. It says, And Yahweh said to Joshua, Don't fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. There shall not a man of them stand before thee. And then verse 9 reads, Joshua therefore came unto them suddenly, and went up from Gilgal all night. But that's not what the text says. The text is actually a lot clearer. When we look at it in OBRY, it just says, Uyaba Aliyem, not Aliyim, being God, Aliyem. So he came towards them. Yusho. So that it always puts the subject, almost always, a lot of times after the verb. It says, so Joshua came to them, and then the word is patam, which is most often translated as suddenly or straightforwardly. And then the next couple words is kol, being all, elile. So what it's really saying in the actual text is that Joshua came to them, being those kings that he was going to make war on, that he came to them suddenly from Gilgal. Not that he went up from Gilgal all night. It says he came to them suddenly in the night, all night. He came at them all night. That's what the actual text reads. So when we go back to the English, that's when we have the next few verses about the sun standing still. So we know that in Joshua 10:9 it's saying that Joshua came to them suddenly all night. Lile is night, Lile is darkness. And then Joshua 10:10, and it says, and Yahweh discomforted them before Israel. He slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and chased them along the way that goes up to Beth Horon, and smote them to Azekah and unto Makkedah. And it came to pass as they fled from before Israel, and they were in their as they were in the going down to Beth Horon, that Yahweh cast great stones from heaven upon them unto Azekah, and they died. And there were more which died from the hailstones than the children of Israel slew with the sword. And then Joshua spake to Yahweh in the day, in the Yom, because it was daylight by this time. They had come to them suddenly all through the night and were chasing them. And then by the time we get to Joshua 10:10, it says Joshua spoke to them in the day. He spoke in the day when Yahweh delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. He said, in the sight of Israel, sun, stand still upon Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon or Ailun. So the sun had come up and the moon is still in the sky. And it said, and the sun stood still and the moon stayed until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hastened not to go down about a whole day. The first thing I take issue with there is that they say the sun stood still in the midst of heaven. No, I would say no, because the moon stayed where it was too. And when we know that he attacked them in the night, and a great deal of this action is occurring in the Lile, the darkness of the night, that when the sun came, we know that the sun rose, it's up, and the moon is in the other part of the sky. And that's a common thing you can see. You can see the sun in the eastern sky and the moon in the west, or the sun in the west and the moon in the east, because the moon is the most visible when the sun is in the extremity of one side of the sky or the other. Then the moon is visible. By the time the sun gets up to full tilt in the midst of the sky, the moon is typically not visible. Now, maybe it would be. And this is not a major point in this, but it kind of is. Because the way they chose to translate that the sun stood in the midst of heaven. But the word that they translate in the midst simply means amid. Not in the middle of, but amid. The sun stood up in the sky. It was daytime. The moon is also standing up in the sky in the daytime. Most of the time when you will see both of these bodies at once, they are in their two extremities. We know that this battle had started and happened through the night when it's dark. So of course it makes complete sense that the sun had just come up and the moon is in the other extremity of the sky. And the reason that this makes the most sense is because we read, for instance, in Joshua 10:13. I've got 3 passages from Joshua 10. Joshua 10:13. What it says is this. Now, I just read 10:13. And so the English translations say, so the sun stood still in the midst of the heaven. I just explained the whole thing with midst of the heaven. And hasted not to go down about a whole day. That's what the English says. But the actual wording simply implies this, okay, that the sun did stand there. The word is omad eshamash b'chatzi shamaim, so in the midst of the sky, not in the middle, amid the sky. And here's what's important. And it says, la atz labua ki iyom tamim. And it is referring to the sun. What it's saying there is it did not hurry to come as it would in a normal day. We know it was just night. Most of the battle, it started at night. It tells us in very plain terms that he came upon them at night, and as the sun comes up, he asked that it would stay and that he could finish them. The sun stays. And then it says, and it did not hurry labua to come, because it would have been in the one extremity of the sky and the moon in the other. But they chose to translate it in a way that would support the schema that they have come up with. And yes, there's a very important reason why they would contrive this sort of schema with these, I can't think of a better word than schema right now. A system. Why they would contrive a system that would make these things different. That would make Baker morning instead of evening. That would make Oreb evening instead of morning. Would make Ba, which is overwhelmingly to come near one thing to the other. They would make that into sunset, which is going away. And they would make Zera, which is a scattering of a thing, the rising of the thing. And we're about to see it. And when we see it, I'm going to have to wrap this one up, and I will continue this same subject in the next episode of the OBRY Hours. This will have to be, I guess, at least 2. In fact, I'm going to do that right now, because the next 4 to 5 verses are pretty much, one is a repeat of hanging bodies, because these kings that he was just warring with near Gibeon did something similar as the king of Oi. He's hung up, and they said that he commanded the bodies to be taken at sundown, according to the text. But if translated consistently, it would be at sunup. And this is Joshua 10:25 through 27. Something very similar. He takes these kings from the cave that they were hidden in. He kills them. He hangs them up. And then it says, as the Shamash Ba, making perfect sense on the coming of the sun, then he takes them down and does these certain things to their body. Makes complete sense that they would do it once the sun came, for many obvious reasons, besides the fact that we're staying consistent with Ba and Bua with Shamash. And now the last verse I'm going to go over to impress upon you the great, great importance of this, besides the fact that it is just huge. The implications are just enormous. Is Joshua 1:4. It's describing everywhere that Israel would inherit as far as the land of Canaan. In Joshua 1:3 it says, every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon that I have given unto you, as I said unto Moses. Now I'm going to read 1:4 in the English. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, even unto the great river, the river Euphrates or Parat, all the land of the Hittites, and unto the great sea, towards the going down of the sun shall be your coast. But in OBRY, when describing these borders, it says, Uod, a yam, and unto the sea, a gadul, the great sea. The border will go unto the great sea, Mabua Eshemash. And if we translate that consistently, it says, the entering of the sun. Not where the sun enters, where the sun is coming. Mabua, bua, always indicates something coming to. Mabua Eshemash, which means that the great sea is not to the west. The great sea would be to the east of the land of Canaan. And that is why all of this is so radically, massively important, and why it's a big subject, and why a lot of work has been done on it in the text to change our perceptions of the orientation of the land. And I further pose this to you. When all of the mass migrations occurred from the land of captivity in Europe and various small other pocket colony places and so on and so forth to North America and the United States, the Celtic, the Germanic, the Scandinavian, and other various Israelite immigrants all came here, spread out, and settled in regions typically called the Ohio Valley region, where cities were still built but had lied in ruin for some great amount of time, including many of the cities all along the East Coast. And they first established 13 colonies, like the 13 because there are 13 tribes, because Joseph gets a double portion. Both his sons Ephraim and Manasseh are counted as a tribe. When you read this over at the end of Ezekiel, and it describes territories that the tribes would eventually be given, it includes 13 of them, all things counted, because Joseph gets that double portion. It also means that if the sea is to the great sea is to the east and not to the west of the land of Canaan, that once again, besides everything else, the land of Palestine is entirely out of the question. So on the next part of this, I am going to pick up, there are a number of other verses, and there are a number of other factors concerning what we see being described as far as the sun's movements, and what we see as far as this idea of Oreb and Boker, and how they have translated them opposite, because they would have to. If the sun is in fact, the movements of the sun are in fact described differently, which puts our orientation opposite of what we thought it was, the evening and the morning words oftentimes have to be swapped as well, and I will go more into those on the next one, starting where I left off here. So until next time, I really do hope everyone out there is safe and not in the newspeak COVID safe way. That you're safe by your faith in our God, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh. So I'll see you next time.